Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. Weather. Believe it or not, it can actually be one of the biggest make or break factors in warfare. Consider key historic examples, like General Eisenhower deciding when to launch the D-Day invasion in between major storms, or even with more current events, for example, when Russia chose to attack Ukraine, then got stuck in the mud. Environmental conditions control when and how we employ military power, and what enemies can then do to us. People tend to take weather assessments for granted. I mean, we're surrounded by it, right? We hear the updates on the radio, you can get the latest forecast with a click of a button on your phone, and it's displayed on screens in office lobbies. But here's the deal. Collecting environmental data, analyzing it, and transforming it into actionable knowledge is very complex. It's even harder when it comes to military applications, because a weather forecast that's good for golf in Miami or a backyard barbecue in Indiana is hardly what's needed for military operations. Not only do conflicts erupt at random locations around the globe, they occur in the most data-starved regions of the world, data which is critical to weather modeling and forecasting. Consider how hard it must have been to generate data about weather in Afghanistan in 2001. We didn't even have good maps, much less precise real-time environmental monitoring data that's crucial when executing modern operations. Concepts like Joint All-Domain Command and Control, JADC2 for short, involve teaming geographically separated combat assets to net a desired effect. And what systems are selected is hugely dependent on weather. One aircraft could be separated from the mission area by a pop-up storm, while another might have a clearer approach, and the same holds true for other domains. Weapon selection is also hugely dependent on weather, with things like laser guidance technology requiring clear skies. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, portions of U.S. assault ground to a halt due to sandstorms. Even more valuable is knowing how weather is affecting the adversary's activities and their pace of operations. Could a line of thunderstorms over that S-300 SAM site provide an opportunity to exploit it? What about the potential for a sudden upslope fog that keeps adversaries' fighters grounded and exposed? Bottom line, warfighters at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels need to understand weather conditions, or more accurately, weather operations, to make smart decisions while also anticipating what the adversary might do. So to help us better understand these realities and how the U.S. tackles the weather mission, it's my pleasure to introduce Colonel Patrick Williams, Air Force Director of Weather. He's responsible for the development of weather and space environmental doctrine, policies, plans, programs, and standards in support of the U.S. Army, the Air Force, and Space Force operations. So, Colonel Williams, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Lucky, and happy to be here and grateful to have the opportunity to tell our story. It's going to be a fun time.
Yeah, excellent. So I tried to explain the weather imperative in my opener, but you really are the expert. When you engage with folks in the service and beyond, how do you explain why the weather mission is so important?
So I think you did a fantastic job in your intro. I typically take a slightly different approach when it comes to that. When people ask me what I do, I tell them that we predict enemy behavior, that we impose cost on the enemy by creating dilemmas for them. How do we create a bad and worse scenario for them to make a decision in? That's what we do. That's
so
my
you're a
mission.
weather god. You can make weather.
No, didn't say that.
I know.
Didn't say that. But what we can do is we can use the laws of physics because if we have a better understanding of the laws of physics, we can use that to predict what's going to happen next. Human nature, we're very predictable, right? So here's a great example. When it's hailing outside, what do most people do? They're not going to stay outside. They're going to seek cover, and they're going to go inside, right? Let's take that to an airfield. Most commanders are not going to leave their jets on the runway. They're going to hangar them. Well, in the age of globalization, best practices across the globe, everyone's doing that, right? This is not rocket science. Literally, it's not. So if there's a hailstorm, and we predict these hailstorms over an enemy territory, over an enemy site, and we know they're going to hangar them, what happens if we drop a dummy bomb right next to the hangar with flyers inside, say, hey, we gotcha? Now, next time a hailstorm comes in, or any storm comes in, now that commander has to decide, do I shelter my aircraft from the weather and make a juicy target for the Americans or not? That's the scenario we want to place them in.
Yeah, so essentially because of the weather intelligence that you provide, we can exploit weather to really create those operational dilemmas for the adversary because we can take advantage of their behavior because they've become so predictable.
Yes, and we deliberately don't use the word intelligence because that has a different set of connotations and different authorities.
Okay.
Authorities that we don't have that the intel community does have.
Got it.
And so we purposely stay away from that.
Interesting. Okay, so for many people, they take weather prediction, observations, all of this capability for granted, and they don't really think about how it happens. It's just magic. They don't understand how much effort and skill is required to turn all of this environmental monitoring data into actionable knowledge. Could you walk us through the technologies and the processes that make this possible?
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty simple. So let's take the United States as the easiest way to look at it. The United States is what I call sensor saturated. Everyone has a sensor in the backyard, basically, and we collect all that data, and it's the typical data you would think of, pressure, temperature, whatever. And it all goes into a supercomputer that starts to calculate all these numbers. And then we use models that take into account fluid dynamics, physics, those types of things, and they push those observations through time. And that's what gives us a forecast. Now, each model is slightly different. There's ones that are better over water, ones that are better over mountains, so on and so forth.
There's a European model. There's a,
Sure, because they're made specifically for different types of terrain.
Oh.
And so when you put them all together and you run them all together, they have convergence and divergence. Where these models agree, we are reasonably certain that that forecast is going to be as the computer predicted it. When it's not, that's where our forecasters are going to go in and start digging in and say, okay, what's going on there? And that's where they make the prediction. The difference is between the civil world and the military world is the airmen are going to apply that forecast to the mission itself. So we're not going to say, hey, partly cloudy, chance of rain tomorrow. We're going to say you're going to have X amount of hours of lost ISR. You're not going to be able to meet your tanker and your fighter in this region to gas up. You might have to go to a different region. Those are the types of applications that they're going to say instead of take an umbrella.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, and I saw that when I was over in Iraq flying the F-16 was that we actually got, as a result of the meteorology that you provided, we could predict how far away we would see the target in our laser targeting pod.
Correct.
Based off of not only the diurnal cycle, but also how much dust, what the weather was, how hot it was, what we expected the potential contrast of temperatures to be. So it was actually very useful because it then impacted the tactical decision choices that we made regarding what access we would take to approach the target or so forth.
You're exactly right.
Pat, we know that the weather conditions, and you mentioned this like temperature, humidity, and wind direction and so forth, are important for initializing the weather models. But the model needs to know where to start so it knows where things should go in the timeframes that you described. So how does space environmental sensing fit into getting the warfighter what they need?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. So the space part is a huge piece of this. So in my example earlier, I mentioned that the U.S. was saturated with observations. But let's go someplace like the Middle East or over the Pacific. I don't have those observations. I have to get it from somewhere. So either we're going to in place observations with our own sensors, and that's onesie, twosies here and there, or I'm going to use space-based capabilities and then use the space-based piece to initialize the model, push it through, and then figure out what that looks like. And that's where the airman's knowledge of satellite meteorology is really going to come into play to provide that forecasting ability.
You know, I think that's a really important point because since we have so many weather models and apps and data and stuff for us here within the United States, I think we take for granted that the places where our warfighters go are going to have that kind of weather data and have the weather sensing, or that we would have access to that kind of weather sensing. And that simply isn't the case. So this is an area where we don't have the luxury of going to commercial off-the-shelf services to provide weather data. And we've done podcasts, and we actually have a paper or report on this, and which we'll include in our show notes regarding the need to have the space sensing weather capability because it is so far past its design life cycle that we are really sort of like playing on the edges there. We've got to get those satellites back up in the air. But to pivot here, I'm curious about what today's warfighter needs for combat planning and operations. And this is connected to what we just talked about, but the ever-important cloud coverage, winds, precipitation. I mean, those are eternal requirements for Air Force pilots. But what else do the planners and operators need?
So what the planners and operators need is not necessarily the wind or the atmospheric conditions themselves. What they're looking for is the when and the where. So we can predict well in advance certain atmospheric conditions that may exist over a particular period at particular timeframes. Now, what the specifics are going to be, we don't know necessarily at that moment in time, but we do have a very good idea of what that's going to look like in the future. So we can start to shape what an operation might look like. So instead of, for example, you had mentioned earlier taking a jet and if there was a sandstorm, laser-guided munitions may not work there, right?
Yeah.
So we can predict, hey, we see in a couple of weeks' time that the wind conditions are going to be such that it's going to pick up some dust. Lasers are not going to work. You might want to go with GPS or you might want to go something else, but we can start to advise that. Better yet, we also think that the enemy is going to hunker down here and here, the where, right? At this time, the when. So if you're going to shape an operation, shape a mission, this is probably where you might want to go ahead and focus your attention. So branch plans and sequels ideally would be conditions-based. We know that these dust storms are going to come. We know these weather conditions might come. Here's a branch plan or a sequel that might be weather conditions-based. When we see these start to form, launch this, do this operation, do this mission, use these munitions, use these platforms.
That's so cool. So let's talk more about the warfighters and the organizations you support, because that clearly, I think, can gel for our audience and understanding of why having service-specific weather capabilities is so crucial, especially because of the mindset that your planners bring and your meteorologists bring to the table, thinking about weather in terms of how do we exploit that knowledge and those modeling for operational campaign planning and real-time operations as well. So with respect to the warfighters and organizations you support, it's got to be a lot. The range must be really expansive. Who are your customers, so to speak, and what are their unique needs?
So it's absolutely expansive. So we definitely provide combat capability to the Space Force, the Air Force, and the Army directly. We do partner with the Navy and the Marine Corps, who provide it to the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Coast Guard. So they provide it to them as well. We also, when it's appropriate, we partner with the Interagency. So think Department of State, Department of Interior, Department of Energy, those folks, where we can. And so where our missions align, we definitely collaborate. So here's a for instance with the State Department, right? So using with the military is easy to think through, but for the State Department.
And say, what do they use you for?
What do they use us for? So we do have a specific unit that focuses on climatology, and it's the only weather unit in the Air Force that's climatology focused, which is long-term trends of the atmosphere. It's not what we think, what we hear in the news necessarily.
Yeah, it's not tomorrow or the next week.
It's not. It's long-term. And so what does the State Department use us for that? So they're interested in, say, I'm going to make something up now because we're going to keep everything unclassified. Let's say we're going to take Africa as an example, and they have multiple watering holes. So they're interested in drought conditions because different tribes are relying on that water source as a vital resource. Well, we also have partnerships with these different tribes to further U.S. interests. So we'll let the State Department know, hey, we're expecting a drought in these coming years or at the end of next year, and we're expecting a drought, and that's where it's going to happen. And then the State Department can go in and start working with the tribes ahead of time to prevent the wars or anything that might come out of the drought scenario.
Yeah, any adverse actions or dynamics that might result from that stressor, that drought stressor.
Correct. And so if they're doing that and they're using diplomacy, then we don't have to come in later
and clean up with the military.
And clean up with the military. So that's how we're looking at it. It works out great. And if they can do that and prevent something and keep the U.S. interest flowing, then that's what we're all about. Yeah, that would just be an example.
That's really amazing, like what you're able to provide to, in this example, the Department of State. But the federal government also has NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. How do you partner with them, or what do you do that's different?
So we partner with NOAA, with their severe weather cells and some other cells that they have. So we are their hot backup. So if they happen to go down for whatever reason, a comm problem or something, we can be their hot backup. And we've done that multiple times. We practice on a regular basis, and that's done out of the 557th Weather Wing. They practice that with NOAA. We also partner and collaborate with our climatology. So it's all at Asheville in North Carolina.
Okay.
And they're both housed in the same building, believe it or not. And they share data and they work together. We also partner with the Space Environmental Center out at Boulder for space weather piece. We have a tri-agency agreement between NOAA, the FAA, and us for our NextRad radars across the CONUS. It's a tri-agency agreement. We are part of ICAMS, which is the Interagency Council for Advancing Meteorological Services. We're all the heads of the weather departments within the interagency, so think Department of Agriculture, Energy, Interior, FAA, NASA, NOAA, so on and so forth. We get together and figure out how do we collaborate and share not just data, but processes. So the last time we talked about hurricane hunters. We have them. NOAA has them. but no one only has so many birds, and we only have so many birds. So how do we best use them to figure out the track and intensity of hurricanes? And what does that look like? And how do we share assets and share the data so that, because it's at the end of the day, it's saving American people, right? The populace. We also partner and participate in SWARM, which is Space, Weather, Operations, Research, and Mitigation. It's a committee led by the National Science and Technology Council. Just recently, they did a tabletop exercise where they had the National Security Council in attendance with that, and they were practicing if we have a Carrington-level event, space weather event, and that's where...
Okay, what's a Carrington-level event? Like, because I was just going to ask you about space weather.
Okay.
Because people don't really think that there is weather in space because there's no atmosphere in space. So can you describe this for us?
Sure. So there's no hail and rain in space.
Yeah.
But what it looks like is a proton event or electron event. And so mass protons and electrons and neutrons come from the sun and impact our solar area, right? And they get trapped into the Van Allen belts, our radiation belts and magnetic field lines. And then they get trapped in that belt, which disrupts satellites, comms, all that. So it really has an impact. And if it's strong enough, it can concentrate on the Earth. So when you look at the aurora borealis as an example, that's space weather.
Yeah, that's the visual that we get.
That's the visual, yep. And so it can knock out power sources. It can knock out power grids. And it has, back in the 80s, it did. It knocked out a whole power source on the eastern seaboard and knocked out the entire eastern seaboard from a power perspective. And it took a while for it to come back up. So if an event like that happened again, and they happen every 11 years, what are we going to do about it? What is the federal government going to do about it? How are the hospitals going to continue to run? How is the police department going to continue to run? How is the FAA going to continue to keep planes in the air? Because it knocks out comm. What does that look like? So they did a tabletop exercise on what are we going to do? So we're part of those scenarios as well. We're part of those committees as well. And that's at the federal government level. Wow.
That's, so again, that kind of event is not something that you can control.
Correct.
So by anticipating it, how do you even anticipate that? How do you measure and model that before those protons and electrons get to the Van Allen belts?
It's extremely difficult, I'll say that. And it's very nascent. The science is very nascent when it comes to that piece of it. But scientists have been able to figure out that there's a correlation between the number of sunspots on the sun.
And solar flares, right?
And solar flares. And then depending on how many in size and the rotation of the sun in relation to where the Earth is, so orbital mechanics, on whether we're going to get hit and how bad we're going to get hit, and roughly what time we're going to get hit, because you can measure that.
Wow.
Manage your money on your time with 24/7 digital banking on the PenFed mobile app. Easily make payments, transfer funds, and deposit checks through mobile deposit.
That's music to my ears.
Learn more at penfed.org. Federally insured by NCOA.
I know. Science, so exciting. But it's interesting because we normally and typically think about satellites and other space assets as not being maneuverable. And so you would think that they would just have to sit there and suck it up. So even if you know it's coming, what can we do about that?
Well, there's lots of things you can do about it. So for example, they can shut off sensitive sensors. So the sensors are off when the event goes through.
So they don't get spiked.
They could turn optical sensors in a different direction so they don't get the brownouts or the whiteouts on their screens. There's a lot of things they can do when it comes to protecting and resource protection from a space environment perspective, when it comes to space assets itself.
Yeah. But then also, as you mentioned, those kinds of events impact not only the assets that we have in space, but also the assets that we have on the ground.
Correct.
And not just military assets, but civilian infrastructure as well.
Correct.
Which is crucial.
Which is why we partner with the federal government and share our data and share our expertise as well.
Okay, so talking about other unique environments that you focus on is the Arctic, right? So environmental monitoring research going on in the poles, specifically the northern pole, the Arctic, which is becoming more strategically important due to actions by Russia and China. So you've been partnering with the University of Maine and Alaska on this to help actualize a DoD Arctic strategy. Could you describe what that is for us?
Absolutely. So we, as you said, we partner with the University of Maine and the University of Alaska to share the science. So who better to figure out the science than academia than a university? So we're working with those guys to figure out what the science is going to look like. So let me explain what this means from an operations perspective. We're used to flying in the mid-latitudes. We're used to flying in, say, the Middle East or the Pacific, where there's a lot of atmosphere, and a lot of things can happen in the atmosphere. But when we go to the Arctic, you have about half that atmosphere. So the atmosphere itself is a lot shorter than expected, which also means that all the things we talked about from the space weather perspective has a much greater effect on operations within the Arctic. So think comm degradation, think ISR degradation, think all those types of things. Anything that has to do with a frequency is probably going to be degraded significantly. The temperatures are an extreme over there as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's the obvious piece. The other stuff that was really interesting, I was like, I hadn't even thought about how this would impact. I think about magnetic variation and how that impacts navigation. I had not thought about comms, RF, things like that.
All that.
So it even just makes having some kind of pine tree type radar sensing even complicates that ability to detect bombers or missiles coming over the poles.
Absolutely. And so if you're at altitude and you're looking down, are you looking at a cloud? Are you looking at snow? Are you looking at ice? Because it kind of looks the same. Which one is it?
It's all white.
It is to the naked eye, but we can figure out which is which using typically satellites because we have the temperature differentiations that we can see. And then how thick is that ice? Can I put a C-130 on that ice? Can I go through the ice? Can I listen through the ice? There's all sorts of things you can imagine, right? We'll stop there. But there's lots of things you can and can't do, just imagination, on how science can help you through that, how meteorology can help you through that, and apply it to the mission itself according to commander's intent.
This is so exciting.
I love it.
such fun science. I'm totally geeking out. So we're talking about all this environmental monitoring, for military applications and civil. And one of the biggest differentiators I expect that we see is the missions drive demand. And this is different from commercial weather capabilities that align with population centers and transportation routes. And we talked a little bit about this earlier regarding how the military goes places and the DoD goes places that are not necessarily within the United States where we don't have commercial assets. So how does that impact the balance between commercial environmental monitoring service versus proprietary DoD capabilities? Because you clearly rely on both, and you've talked about that so far within this podcast. But I'm guessing that there are times when an organic solution is crucial because you have to have that assured coverage over regions that might not align with the commercial business case or even have capabilities that are not offered by commercial services. So, and then what about operational security regarding the kind of environmental weather data that you provide for warfighter needs? So it's very interesting regarding what you need to maintain regarding security when we think about this in terms of classification and uses versus commercial applications.
Fantastic question. And it's a bit complex, and there's two major parts to this. So I'll hit the first one first, which is missions do drive demand, both on the military and the civil side. And for two of the missions that we have, two of the three, they're similar, but the third one is very, very different. And so the first one, for example, is resource protection. So that mission is driven by demand. And so for the military, we obviously want to protect our assets and protect our people, just like on the civilian sector, right? So hailstorm, we're going to let people know. And so on the civilian side, they do the same thing. Think hurricanes, think whatever the government needs to know, so on and so forth. So from that perspective, it's basically the same. Think mission generation. That's the second one, right? So we look at mission generation as how do I get blue assets in the air to its target and back safely, on time, bombs on target, the whole 9 yards, and do its thing. Civil side, same thing. Think the FAA. I got to get a commercial flight from LA to New York.
What are your takeoff minimums, your landing minimums? What's the weather in between? Do you need to reroute around thunderstorms?
So I have fuel, all that, right? So we do the exact same thing. Fuel calculations versus cargo calculations versus munitions calculate, all that, right? Well, the pilots do that, but we help with the weather piece of that. Yeah. So those two parts are basically the same. The third part is where we diverge quite a lot, and I haven't found a civil equivalent. And that's where we apply the tradecraft to the enemy itself. How do we maintain our freedom of maneuver and our freedom of action while the enemy is going to be degraded? So we know, just like the examples we gave, right? The enemy will be degraded in these spots at these times. Now's the time to hit. If we're going to attack, this is the time to do so. Or we can say, hey, we don't have to play defense today because we know they can't come out and meet us in the playground. So we could take a break, we could take a breather, maybe do some maintenance, we could do whatever we need to if we don't feel like attacking that day. So it offers us a lot more advantages, and that's how we apply that piece of it, because we apply it to the red piece of that. The other half of the question you were asking was really about our reliance on commercial data. And this is where I personally have a big beef with this. I have no problem sharing the data, I have no problem working and using all the data we have, but we need to have our own proprietary DoD data. And the reason for that is because our counterparts at NOAA have an internal mandate that they're going to share it with, say, the World Meteorological Organization, which is run mostly by China. Other countries...
Really?
It is. At the upper echelons, they're all Chinese. So that's a problem, obviously. And so we share all of our data. But other countries, like China, and they've done this in the past, they don't. They'll share it when it's convenient for them, but they'll turn it off at the drop of a hat.
So they have access to all of our information, but we don't have access to their information.
You got it. So now we are at asymmetric disadvantage. But if we have our own stuff that we have, and it's just for the DoD as an example, and we can share when we deem necessary and not when we deem not, right, and make it classified or whatever we need to make it, now we still have that asymmetric advantage because we have data that no one else has. And that's something that we need to have for our own forces to be able to predict their maneuvering, their actions, as well as our own.
Oh, that's interesting. And I would also assume that from a DoD perspective, there might be some elements of environmental conditions that we would be interested in that might not be of interest to a commercial organization.
Perhaps, especially in the way we apply it. So in the commercial sectors, they're going to look at it primarily through a resource protection lens. How do I save people and assets? We are not always going to look at it from that perspective. And so when the two perspectives and missions diverge, the purpose diverges, and the types of data that you're looking for and want and don't want are going to be completely different as well. And so we're going to want different types of information than, say, the civil sector. But the good news is our forecasters are awesome. Our airmen are fantastic. And they'll take whatever they can get and they'll turn it to our advantage as best they can. The problem is if you don't have data, you don't have data. But if you do have something, these guys are going to work some magic and they're going to make it happen. Well, trust my weatherman.
Yeah, no.
These airmen are awesome. They're absolutely awesome.
And that's something that I've seen across all mission areas within the Air Force is just how incredible our airmen and our warfighters are doing what they do with the resources they have. But in the end, it's our moral obligation to ensure that they have the resources, the tools, the data, the sensors that they need to do what our nation asks of them and what we rely on them to do. And that means ensuring that they have the DoD organic assets, whether or not that's space-based or otherwise, so that they have the data so they can help shape that into an operational advantage for us.
And so here's the thing, and I'm not naive enough to think that, this is all there is. And I've been in the business long enough to realize that I only have $1 to spend, but I have 50 things I got to buy.
Yeah.
And so what's more important? Well, it may not be the weather thing today or tomorrow or the next day, and I understand that. But it is important. And so we're working what we can to get what we need as best we can. So we're working with science, like these universities, to figure out how do we manipulate the information that we do have to turn into the pieces that we need to have. The information that you need.
That's like, alchemy right there.
Like AI and machine learning. So for example, a radar image. A radar image is done by a radar, and it's typically over land, and that's where we have our radars. You don't see radars over the ocean. But through AI, artificial intelligence, they've been able to correlate satellite imagery with radar imagery, and now we have global synthetic weather radar over the water, which gives us a whole lot of different information that a satellite just wouldn't necessarily do. It's AI generated, so there's a
fudge factor, right?
There is, but the forecasters can pick most of that out anyway. But it gives us a whole different set of information that we can use to our advantage.
No, that's
how we use that.
So, there's a saying that, all models are wrong. Some are just more useful than others. Where do you ferret that out? How do you determine, the veracity of these models, given the fact that it's basically generating synthetic data?
Sure. So I like the different approach. Like, all models are right. You just got to pick the right one. And so that's where the forecaster comes in, who understands the science behind it to say, okay, this model's geared mostly toward mountains and I'm over the water. So I'm going to favor this other one instead, or I understand that this is diverging a little bit, so I'm going to make up for it over here. And they use their gray matter between their ears to figure it out. And that's where the airmen really come into play. And that's why the data alone is not going to be enough to put into these systems. You have to have the airmen there to interpret the data against the mission set itself to meet commander's intent. If you don't have the weather airmen there, you're going to miss that vital interpretation piece.
No, and I'm glad you bring that up because it's absolutely crucial. I mean, the advantage that human cognition intuition and wisdom provides commanders in terms of what our operational options are and how to obtain the advantage is crucial. Data is just data. How you turn that into wisdom, it's the airman that does that.
100%.
So let's discuss real-time mission taskings. So for example, JADC2, Joint All-Domain Command and Control. How is this impacting how you're approaching environmental monitoring? I mean, it's not actually a thing yet, but we're moving in that direction. And I'm guessing that's placing, an imperative on things, for example, more frequent sensor revisit rates. And is that why the Joint Requirements Oversight Council updated space-based environmental monitoring refresh rates from 4 hours to 1 hour? I know it's super creepy, but I'm guessing it has a pretty big impact, especially regarding the ATO.
In part. So the JADC2 is a command and control concept, and it's not necessarily a material solution. And the way I look at it, it's more of a common operating picture with the ability to pass and receive orders. So it's a different type of system that we would have. We have weather layers in different systems because multiple units use different systems. Like the combatant commands, as example, use Maven is their biggest one, and we have a layer in Maven. The Army, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, they all use different systems, and we try to put our weather layer in those as well. And at the end of the day, it's just passing data. But like we said before, we need that airman to interpret the data. Where the JROC piece comes in is several years ago, they made an incorrect assumption. And that incorrect assumption was that we could rely on a family of systems, commercial systems, to get what we needed to get because our own DoD systems were going to still be alive. That proved false, actually. We're still making similar assumptions that are still actually kind of false, but they did change the refresh rate to a 1 hour. The way they're looking at doing it right now is mostly with commercial satellites.
Okay.
There's an issue with that, of course, because we don't own them. So if they decide to turn them off, share the data, whatever, we're back to square one, just like we were before. So it's like, okay, so where do we stand with that? So why is it so important, especially in a combat environment? I was in Afghanistan back in 2013, and the atmosphere was ripe for thunderstorms. And so we saw a thunderstorm develop, grow, and then collapse within a half an hour. Within 30 minutes, it popped up and then collapsed.
It just didn't have the energy to sustain growth.
It didn't, but what it did do, though, when it collapsed, it pushed a gust front out like a big
massive
ring.
Microburst. Yeah.
A microburst. And in that environment, it caused a brownout scenario because the dust was there. Unfortunately, and I was doing Army operations at the time, we had 2 Black Hawks in the zone, and they both crashed. Because first off, the gust front moved them, and they couldn't see, brownout conditions. So instead of pulling up, they were actually not, and then they turned and hit the ground. So we lost both helicopters because of that brownout scenario. All that happened within a 30-minute span. So a 1 hour refresh rate,
Still
maybe not going to cut it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's why we need something a lot better, and we need our own systems to be able to do that. And with the cost of satellites going down these days and everything else, again, it's a choice we have to make. I only have $1 to spend. What am I going to spend it on? And I understand that. But those are the scenarios that we're looking at. And if we had that, would it have saved those 2 helicopters? Maybe, maybe not. But had we been in planning, for sure, we'd say, hey, the atmosphere's condition is ripe for brownout conditions, for gust fronts, for down microbursts. Maybe we might want to avoid this area today. And we could have done that, right? But again, we have to be left of bang, way left of bang to be able to do that. There's planning weather, and then there's tactical weather. We need to be more in the planning and less in the tactical.
Yeah. Well, and even if the choice was still made to launch those helicopters, if they understood the risks, they could implement risk mitigation strategies to be able to address those kinds of scenarios, as opposed to being surprised by them.
100%.
This really touches on to another key trend that we've talked about over and over, but I just think is really important to emphasize and dig into is that the weather mission is evolving from just sort of the standard forecasting and monitoring. It's really moving into strategy work and mission planning and mission execution. So could you talk more about that? Because that's really, I think, something that is so important for our audience to understand.
Yeah, so we're actually trying to regain our muscle memory on strategy and planning. So before 9/11, we had weather folks even at the combatant commands, at the 06 level, to do a lot of the planning that we had before, that we were doing before. Once 9/11 kicked off, the Air Force realized a couple things. One, we inherited air superiority, so I didn't really need to plan or strategize as much as I did before. And I could do almost everything within the ATO cycle.
3-day cycle. Mm-hmm.
And so all the planning goes into the ATO cycle, which is kind of condensed at the tactical level. I could do everything there because I had no threats in the air. The only threat I had in the air was weather. What are the obstacles I'm going to face today? And so that was the threat. And so what happened is we were at the very, very end of the cycle. What threats am I going to see today before I walk to the jet? And so we got kind of pushed to that. And that became our new muscle memory for the last 20 years. So now what we're trying to do is return the ship back to where we were, regain the muscle memory of determining the when and the where and planning and targeting. Because that's where we need to go.
So this really gets into another concept that you've been pushing, which is weaponizing Air Force weather to leverage as a tool to anticipate, predict, and understand, and even prevent enemy actions. And it comes down to arming our leaders and our commanders to understand how to use weather and the associated science as a serious mission effector. And you've talked about this before, but please just go into it a little bit more.
Okay. I think the best way to do this is probably with an example.
Yeah.
So I saw this in the news a couple of weeks ago, so I'm going to keep this totally unclassified, so they were there. But in the news a couple of weeks ago, I saw that we had our jets up in Alaska, right against the Russian-U.S. border, and then the Russians would come and meet us, and they do this quite often, right? So we have one side will have a patrol, the other side will meet them, and they'll peel off and do
escort,
and do that.
Good
back
photo
and forth.
ops.
It's fantastic. I love it. So let's put weather as a weapon in here now. So now we're going to predict that the location that they're going to launch their alert aircraft from is going to have a thunderstorm in 1 hour, right? Because we can predict that, right? We know that this thunderstorm is going to roll over that airfield in 1 hour. So we say, hey, launch. Now's the time to launch. Remember, we talked about branch and sequels and based on conditions. Okay, launch your aircraft now, get them up against the border, and have those guys launch before the thunderstorm comes in. Now we have our jets and their jets are up. Now we know that that thunderstorm is just about to hit their runway, and we peel off. So now what's going to happen with those Russian jets? They have 3 choices. Risk the weather. That's a risk. That's a cost. Go to an alternate site. That's a cost. Burn gas in the sky. That's a cost. But either way, we put them in a dilemma, right? Because we denied their freedom of action because their original action was to go back to home station. Well, now they can't. And we chose when to do that deliberately. That's an idea. That's an example of weaponizing weather. Now, your imagination can run wild on the classified side on what you can and can't do, but that's just an unclassified example of how you can use this to our advantage.
Oh, I so love this. So what are the cultural changes that you're going to need to develop within your airmen so that they all have this level of perspective and expertise, because it requires a knowledge that goes well beyond just standard meteorology?
Absolutely. So we're trying to shift our culture from a science-minded one to a warrior-minded one. Because
Yay.
Since 9/11, that's the role that we were asked to play by the Air Force. We were asked to be mostly scientists to figure out how accurate can you be, what's the timing exactly, and we focus primarily on the forecast itself. Now we're trying to say, hey, the forecast is not the mission. The forecast is your tool. Your mission is what your command chain told you, and your commander's intent is how you're going to get after that. So how do you apply now your meteorology and your tradecraft to ensure that that mission becomes a success according to commander's intent? That shift is kind of tough for people to kind of think through, as we're so used to, I got to focus on the forecast itself because it's got to be exactly accurate. Well, not necessarily. There's perfect and there's good enough. Maybe good enough is literally that. It's just good enough so that we can focus on how do we mess with the enemy.
Yeah, what you brought up is really interesting because in the 80s and the 90s, I mean, I remember when we get up in the morning and we'd see the 7-day forecast and it was really just like a smiley sunshine or a frowny rain cloud. And that was about as good as weather forecasting got because we didn't have the data, we didn't have the models, and we certainly didn't have the calculation and the processing power to be able to have the level of accuracy and fidelity that we do now. So I think maybe the advancements of technology is partly what is liberating your airmen to have this kind of mental mind shift where they don't have to focus so much on how accurate am I, but how to employ weather tactically and operationally to achieve that kind of advantage.
Yes, I think, yes, for sure the technology definitely advanced to the point where we can use it in a completely different way.
Yeah.
I think, though, it was more the environment, no pun intended, that we were in. So if you think about 9/11, when 9/11 kicked off, where did we go? We went to the Middle East.
Yeah.
And the Middle East is, for the most part, benign weather. Right? Most days are sunny, cloud-free, go fly, have fun, right? Where do we train? Nellis. Cloudy, cloud-free, nice days, go train and go have fun. Weather was not a factor. And so that's what we trained to. That's what our muscle memories were. Now, today, where might we fight? somewhere in the Pacific, every day is a weather event.
Every hour is a weather
Every
event,
hour is a
right? Because it's so dynamic with the energy and the temperatures and the humidity and all of that stuff.
Look what happened in the Ukraine. Look what happened with Russia in the Ukraine. The tanks got stuck in the mud, right?
Mm-hmm.
We forecasted that months in advance. We knew that was going to happen. Now, pretend for a second that it wasn't Ukraine but us, and we knew this was going to happen because we had forecasted that. My advice to the UCOM commander would have been, or USAFE commander at that point would have been, hey, do you have any A-10s? What a perfect time to use your A-10s at that point, right? I know we're trying to get rid of them.
No, stationary targets. No, I totally understand what you're talking about because this allows you to predict what their choices might be.
What we've done in the past it's not just our airmen that have to have a culture shift and mindset shift.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Air Force. Because if you think about it, how do our current decision makers think about weather and how are they employing weather capabilities, right? It's a resource protection capability to them. It's not a weapon yet. So I spent all last year doing a roadshow, so to speak, and I talked to almost all the A3s, the combatant commands, air component commands, talked to combat commands, all these other places to talk about exactly that. How do we use weather as a weapon? We were fortunate to be in different environments so we could talk more freely and more detailed.
Mm-hmm.
And every single one said, oh my, I never thought of it that way. I like that idea. That opens up a whole set of opportunities and avenues that we weren't really exploring before that can really provide an advantage. So we can do this. And all we really need to do now is start to put our folks more into the planning cells, the targeting cells, the exercise cells, and those places where we don't have them today, to get integrated into those teams to apply that weather knowledge into those planning events and create those branches and sequels that we were talking about before.
Yeah, no, and that's really interesting because we don't necessarily have weather and using weather as a weapon built into our doctrine or our mindsets. So it's not just a mindset shift for your airmen and as they're looking at how do they then wield this expertise and this knowledge to provide an advantage and decision options for their commanders. It's also about the planning staffs and the commanders understanding that weather is there as a resource for them and needs to be integrated into their planning and their execution teams.
Which is a double advantage, right? Because it's not in our doctrine, and we know that our enemy looks at our doctrine.
That's true.
Talk about a double surprise. So people usually ask me, well, because I go to different conferences, what's your solution then? And my solution is that if we either A, have our own constellation like the DMSP, we bring that back, and there's a cost with that, or we change our governmental policies so that we don't have to share data to everyone all the time. And then we have a deciding body that says this is not going to be shared. One has a fiscal cost, the other one has a political cost.
Well, but then also, if we choose to not share our data, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have data to see inside of China or the capability to see inside of China. And so it might be a defensive capability if we change the policy, but doesn't necessarily provide us the offensive weather capability that we would need.
Right, but then it also puts us back on equal terms. So
True.
I'd rather be on equal terms than have a disadvantage. So if China has all their data and ours, okay, that's bad. But if China only has theirs and we only have ours, okay, I'd prefer those terms.
As opposed to exactly. I mean, I would rather have the ability to do both, right? I mean, reconstituting the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program so we have our own organic DoD capabilities, I think is a no-brainer because if you don't, the investments that you make in capabilities that you either can't lose or you can't use or you lose, similar to the Black Hawk story that you shared earlier, if we're losing that because we don't have the meteorological data, that's almost as bad as not making investments in those weapons capabilities either. So if you look at weather now as a weapon, as you're proposing, and that becomes then foundational to operations. So to reap the investments of our other capabilities, we have to have made those investments in weather so we can use them to their best advantage.
100%. And there's a lead time to launching satellites. So we have to invest now.
Yeah, no.
Unfortunately.
But fortunately, satellites are coming down. The cost of satellites is coming down. The cost of launch is coming down. And so we might get to a point where putting up that new constellation isn't going to be the same barrier that we've seen in the past, where we had really exquisite and exquisitely expensive satellites. And so I think we might be on an inflection point where not only do we realize that this is a strategic and operational imperative, it's a capability that's foundational to how we wage war, but also the cost of doing so has come down. So speaking of space weather, and a Space Command is going to have a new weather and environmental science officer on the J3. So this is very similar like what we talked about, and they're going to be focusing on orbital warfare. So could you explain this development and its significance? Because it sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So earlier I mentioned we did this roadshow and I talked to these different organizations, and I went to Spacecom and I talked to the J3 Major General Endicott. And we were able to talk about one of his hot topics, which is orbital warfare and how to do that. And so I was able to explain to him how we can use space weather and terrestrial weather to achieve his desired effects according to his intent. And not only do it the way he was looking at, but also have plausible deniability in doing so. And so it wasn't just the data alone that was going to help him achieve what he was looking for, but he needed to have somebody, as we talked about earlier, an airman who knew what they were doing and how to apply that. He liked the idea so much that he wanted to put that individual on his staff, directly on the J3 special staff. And so within Air Force Weather, we have multiple airmen with PhDs in space weather, space physics type studies. The one we ended up choosing, we have a second weather squadron, primarily focuses on space weather and some other things as well, but primarily on space weather. And they're part of the 557th Weather Wing. And that commander is graduating this summer, and she's going to go to the Spacecom J3. She'll be the first one there to provide that because she's fresh from the squadron doing exactly that for all these other folks. So she's going to be the first one, and she's going to focus primarily on orbital warfare, offensive weather, using it as a weapon, and then how do we achieve Spacecom's intent using both space and terrestrial weather. Because if you think about it, a thunderstorm between the sender and receiver will disrupt comms just as much as a solar flare.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's fascinating. So what else should our audience know about your weather mission?
It's not just a force multiplier, but it actually is a weapon. The weapon can either amplify kinetic effects or it can just be a standalone and help set up patterns of behavior. It can certainly interpret patterns of behavior as well, or help interpret patterns of behavior. But when it's used deliberately, it can bridge the gap of inventory overmatch. So we know China has 5 times more stuff than we do, right? But if you use the weather properly, you can negate that. You can negate mass in this scenario by using the weather appropriately. It also offers plausible deniability when you need it. It's just the weather. So you all know all the joke, right? What's the best joke? How do you know when the weather guy's lying to you? His lips are moving. I love that joke because I can be wrong. I have plausible deniability. So if I give you a forecast, did I give you the right one? Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. Are you willing to take the chance? Either way, there's other things you can use it for and use it with, right? It depends on how you use it. So now we're obviously partnering with others. Intel, Cyber, PA, all these other folks.
I was going to say, this opens up opportunities for all sorts of like disinformation campaigns.
And so this is not a weather alone thing, right? We're a team. And we're a team like everybody else. We're an equal contributing member to this massive team. And so when you put this piece of the puzzle back in, right, that's where we need to focus our attention. We spend the vast majority of our time in the atmosphere. We live it, we breathe it, we fly through it. That's our medium. That's where we go. Why don't you want to know about it? We can forecast what it's going to look like. When you get in a car, you use your GPS, right? You probably use some sort of form of GPS to tell you which road you're going to take and when you're going to make a left turn or right turn or stop or whatever. Why wouldn't you do that with the atmosphere? We can provide that. Why would you fly blind? That doesn't make any sense to me, right? So we can do that as well. So what we're saying is we need to be way left of bang in the planning, in the targeting, to figure out the when and the where, and then push that forward, and then let everything else happen on the back end.
Well, I think you're also clearly a portion of the execution as well. But getting you in the planning and all of that, that's key because you don't want to be reactionary when it comes to weather. You want to employ weather, and you can only do that when you're planning.
Correct.
Okay, so war story. Give me a there I was. We're shooting our watches.
Okay. All right, so I was a captain, and I had just come off of aft space at the time out of Vandenberg Air Force Base. This was in 2002, and I was doing space weather specifically there. So I was very versed in that. 9/11 had kicked off, and I said, okay, I got to get in this fight. So I volunteered for Army support. And they sent me to the 3rd Battlefield Weather Squadron out at Fort Hood, Texas at the time. and I immediately deployed to Iraq. And we're sitting on the counter, and I was with 4th Infantry Division, and we're sitting there doing our thing. And being the space weather nerd that I was at the time, I was still monitoring the stuff, and I saw this massive flare hit. It was an X-class flare. It was a big flare. And I knew that was going to take out our comms for about 15 minutes in certain frequencies. It happened to be the frequencies we were using during that time frame. And so I immediately went to the chief of staff, the commander, and the G3 and the G6 and said, hey, we're about to lose comm for 15 minutes, but it's going to come right back up. Well, that was a big issue at the time because typically preceding an attack, our comms would drop, and then we would get attacked, and the comms would come back up. So everybody was kind of on pins and needles. Well, sure enough, it hit, and we lost comms. And General Ordinero, who was the 4th Infantry Division commander at the time, looked at then Captain Pat Williams and looked at me, looked at everybody else, and he did what any other good Army general would do. G6, change those batteries, get my comm back up. G3, get those guys on the... He put everybody on battle stations and go, 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 go. And sure enough, nothing happened. And then 15 minutes later, everything popped right back up. Never said another word, but I gained a lot of credibility that day. And it carried me through the rest of the deployment. It was awesome. So that's how I used space weather, which is typically a strategic thing, in a tactical environment. That's the only time I know of that anybody actually did that.
No, that's fast. I would not typically think about these kinds of solar flares having that kind of impact on our communications. But if we know that that's happening to us, we can anticipate that that's going to happen to the adversary and use that blackout period to our advantage, even if it means we move into different frequency spectrums to be able to maintain our own blue comms while we're exploiting a red blackout.
100%.
Oh, super cool.
That's
Thank
awesome.
you. Thank you for joining this session of Weather with Heather.
Thanks for having me here, and thanks for allowing us to tell our story. This is awesome.
Can't wait to have you guys come back and talk more about how you're actually employing this and implementing this, because as this new approach to weather and weaponizing weather seeps across all the combatant commands, our major commands, and how we employ in our planning staffs, it's going to be really interesting.
That's what we're hoping for. We've already started redesigning our pipeline, our training pipelines, our talent management framework, and how we deliberately develop our airmen within the weather career field. So we've already started doing that. We've already gotten seats in different courses where they're learning how to do the planning piece again so that they can be credentialed and certified. So when they actually do go to these different cells and places and at the air components or wherever, they're versed and certified on how to do that job, as well as apply their weather tradecraft.
Well, we know you'll have arrived when there's a weather weapons patch.
That's right. We're working on it.
Colonel Williams, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for allowing us to tell our story. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's great. With that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's discussion. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great aerospace power kind of day. See you next time. Okay, that's just so cool. So it reminds me, what was the China thriller? It was a China military thriller where they use weather, a typhoon. They mask the typhoon. I'm gonna have to look it up. Hold on just a minute. It was really good. Hold on.
Usually weather movies make us cringe.
I know.
No, it wasn't a weather movie. It was Sharknado.
Twister?
White Sun War.
I don't think I've seen it.
No, it's not a movie. White Sun War. So it's a military thriller, and it's got space in it, and there's a whole China thing. And how they ending up winning the war is weather sees a typhoon coming up the strait. And then they use cyber and space to be able to mask the weather from China so China doesn't know the typhoon is coming up. And they launch and they get hit by the typhoon, and we use weather to our advantage.
That sounds a lot like D-Day. That's exactly what happened at D-Day, by the way. Did you guys know that? You guys know the story of D-Day?
That it got postponed by 3 days because of weather?
Yeah, but there's more to the story. It's actually an air superiority story, believe it or not.
Okay, do tell.
So the weather guys were watching this, and were the Axis forces. The Nazis were looking at it as well. And it was this massive low-pressure system coming, storm after storm after storm.
Yeah.
And the difference is that on the Allied side, we were knocking out their recon planes. We were not allowing the recon planes to go out into the ocean to take the observations like they were supposed to do, because back in those days, we used planes to take observations, so we didn't have satellites and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So we were blocking their recon planes from going into the upstream of where they were going to have.
So they could anticipate the weather that was coming.
They couldn't see it. But what we saw was a high-pressure bubble come right through. That was the January 6th window that we were able to forecast
6th,
for because we had the asymmetric advantage of knowledge at that point that the Nazis did not. And so that was the winning forecast because we were able to block the enemy recon flights, and our recon flights were flying instead. That's what the air superiority piece did, which allowed that data to go to the forecaster to say, okay, here's your window of opportunity when the sea states are going to be enough so you can do amphibious landings and so on and so forth.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that piece. Mm-hmm. I knew that the weather was a key element of playing it, but I didn't know we were knocking out their recon weather and then preventing them from being able to have that data to anticipate when we would launch.
As far as I know, that was a deliberate plan to do so that we would have a asymmetric knowledge advantage over the enemy.
Oh,
and it paid off.
Super cool.
Big time.
Another thing that was interesting that I didn't realize, but, flying around airplanes, you collect all sorts of air data, right? And that commercial airliners share that data with NOAA and the National Weather Service. And so during the course of COVID, when airline travel went down to zero, that's why our weather forecasts went really wonky, is because we weren't capturing all of this passive air data from all the commercial airliners that are flying not only over the CONUS, but internationally as well.
You're absolutely correct. I giggle a little because the National Weather Service was dealing with the problem that we deal with on a day-to-day, because we don't have the same data that they do, obviously. Yeah. And when you go overseas, and that's where we typically go, we don't focus necessarily on CONUS weather. That's where we do training. No, because
we don't want to fight at home. We want to fight elsewhere. We want to project power and take the fight on the other side.
But I don't have aircraft telling us what the observations are up there, right? Because they're not going to call me. Okay. So we're doing what we got with what we have. And it's because of the airmen's ingenuity that we're still successful the way we are.
So actually that brings up a really interesting question, is that for our combat aircraft, for the U.S. Air Force inventory, do we share the weather data that our air data computers are collecting with weather, Air Force weather?
That's a good question. In a combat zone, I'm not aware that we are, actually, because there's so many other things going on that's not a high priority. So there are other things that are happening and other things that the aircraft needs to do.
Well, yeah, we need to prioritize the bandwidth. So we don't want to share that stuff real time. There are times when you don't want to emit, so you're not going to be sharing air data, observations, real time. But when we get back, could we download ADC information and share that? And would that be useful, even if it's like 4 hours old?
It could be. What we'd have to do is we'd have to download it and send it back to one of our supercomputers, as an example, which we have a couple of different ones that we actually use. And they would have to gonculate it and then push it back out to us. So I have to understand what the utility might actually be. So I really don't know the answer to that question. I just know that when I was there, we didn't use that. We didn't get it.
Yeah, I didn't think so either. I mean, so that the ADC information is typically used for, it's correcting the aircraft's flight management system, it's correcting the aircraft's control measures and all of that. So it's more about flight data. But it just is interesting to me, is there a similar analog from commercial aircraft to the National Weather Service that we could use with U.S. combat aircraft for our Air Force weather, even if it were several hours old and there was a level of latency? So I don't know if it can improve the models or not.
I think you said it earlier. So on a commercial aircraft, you want people to know where you are.
Oh, yeah.
Right? We don't want planes run into each other. So we want to transmit all the time. In a combat aircraft, we don't.
Yeah.
Right? So if we don't want to continue to transmit in that, I probably use the space on an aircraft and the limited weight that it has for other sensors than for that. So,
the ADC stuff is happening anyways all the time. So I was just curious, would there be utility even if there was a latency to the information?
I think there might be. I do.
I don't know.
Until we actually use it,
There's no way to tell.
There's no really no way to, because what'll happen is we'll send the data to these guys. We have a whole entire squadron, the 16th Weather Squadron. These guys have more PhDs in the squadron than most hospitals do. It's amazing. These guys are brilliant beyond belief. They'll take stuff and they'll figure out a way to manipulate the information and come out with an outcome. It's like, I never thought of that. That's brilliant. And it's like, yeah, we just used that aircraft's pitot tube, whatever data, and we got this. Like, really? And next thing you know, I have another tool in the arsenal. And so until we actually try it, why not? Let's do it. Let's get after it. I'm all for it.
Well, hey, thanks so much, Pat. I'm so glad you came over. It's been a super fun conversation.
This is awesome.
All righty. I think we're done.
Okay.